Those of you who need to be introduced to the speakers, let me first introduce Serish Nanisetti. Serish is a senior journalist with The Hindu, and he has recently published a beautiful book on Hyderabad, its evolution through the ages, and it's called Bhagnagar and Hyderabad. And then Benjamin Cohen, professor of history at University of Utah, Salt Lake City, Utah. And Ben has a deep interest in South Asia and particularly in Hyderabad. He has already written an earlier book on the club life in India. And Ben basically lives in two places, Salt Lake City in Utah and the State Archives in Tarnaka, Hyderabad. He divides his time between these two places. And this evening, we are going to discuss Ben's new book, new in the sense it was released last year. We actually hoped to get him for HLF 2020, but unfortunately, he couldn't get away from his teaching. And this book is going to be in discussion today. And before I hand over to, this is the book. Thank you, Serish. Thank you, Ben. This is an appeal to the ladies of Hyderabad, a scandal in the Raj, which was published in 2019. And before I hand over to Serish, I would like to make one quick announcement about the next event. 15 days from now, on 26th June, we will have our next online event, HLF online event. And for this, I'm delighted to announce that we will have Rajmohan Gandhi in conversation with Adhiraj Parthasarathi, and the conversation would focus on Rajmohan Gandhi's book on South India. And for this, once again, of course, I will send you all, once again, invitation, information, but those of you who are here with us today, please do join us once again on 26th, 7 p.m. as usual, 7 p.m. on 26th, Friday, the 26th of June. So with these few words, I hand over to Serish for the conversation, and we will have the conversation for the next 15 to 20 minutes. And meanwhile, please start sending your questions, queries, and comments, and I'll be collecting them and asking them on your behalf. So over to you, Serish and Ben. Have a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, Ben. What time is it? In India, it is evening 7 p.m.
Well, good evening, Suresh, and hello, Vijay. It's 7:34 in the morning here in Salt Lake City. So good morning from the US.
And good evening from India. Okay, so I went through this book. What drew your attention to this particular pamphlet, and how did you first lay your hand on it? Because many of us in Hyderabad haven't heard of it before.
Yeah, so this is a book that I was, in a sense, was working on for almost 20 years when I was a student at the University of Wisconsin, which has a long history of South Asian studies and Telugu and Urdu, and a connection to Hyderabad and the Deccan. My mentor there, actually, as he was retiring, was cleaning out his office and gave me a stack of Xeroxed papers. And those papers were the Xerox copy of the trial transcript, which was the heart of this case. And so I sort of looked at it then, and I set it aside, and I did some other projects. And then a few years ago, went back to those papers and was really interested in the story of Mehdi Hasan and Ellen Donnelly.
So the book deals with multiple things like race, sexuality. It deals with parda. And so how was it the mistake of Mehdi Hasan to allow his wife to discard parda?
That's a great question. You know, Mehdi Hasan, I think, recognized the two worlds in a sense that he was part of. On the one hand, he was an Indian, he was a Muslim, he was from North India, then coming to Hyderabad. And so he understood that for his wife to observe Parda was socially acceptable and maybe preferable at the time. But then Ellen, of course, was of European heritage, and he saw that she could give him access in social circles to the British side of India at the time, and in particular the residency and the staff there. And so he, I think they must have had a conversation about it. And I think she probably is the one who said, look, you know, we're not in Lucknow anymore. Let me come out of Purda and dress and behave as an English woman here in Hyderabad. And he probably thought that was a good idea. And as I say, they were a power couple, I think, in Hyderabad by the time they got there.
But wasn't he taking a risk, because he knew there are many officials in the upper ranks of Nizam administration who are from the north, who are from Lucknow and other places.
Right.
So they would recognize her, and he knew her background. So wasn't he taking a risk?
Yes, I think it was a risk, and it's, you know, he might not have understood her background entirely, and the response that her coming out of Parda and circulating as a respectable woman in Hyderabad at the time, how upsetting that would have been to the North Indians who were there in Hyderabad. So it was a risk, and they both paid a price for that.
So you think he miscalculated how people would react to her? Was it? Or did he use her in a sense?
I think initially it worked to his advantage for her to come out of Parda and circulate as a respectable British woman. But then, as the book describes, and as we know, he became incredibly successful in Hyderabad. And I think there was a degree of jealousy of his success. He was even called to London and took the bar there. They met with Queen Victoria. And so at a point, people turned against him, and they used her coming out of Parda as part of the weapon in bringing them down.
Do you have a real suspicion who was behind the pamphlet?
Well, in the book, I don't definitively say. I think I think a couple people were probably involved. There was a rumor that the original pamphlet was in Urdu and then translated to English. I'm not too sure about that. Certainly people like Server Jung, Vasudeva Rao, there were several names. Some of the Bilgramis were implicated, but there was never a smoking gun that let me say with confidence who wrote the pamphlet.
Yeah, Serish, can I? Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you. All of our audience may not know the plot of the book. So may I request Ben to quickly, in a couple of minutes, actually tell us what this book about, and then Serish can ask the questions.
Sure. So the book is the story of a couple, a man named Mehdi Hasan, who is from North India, who meets a woman who's born in India named Ellen Donnelly of European or British heritage. They meet, they get married. Mehdi Hasan is recruited from Lucknow under Sir Salar Jung, the first Salar Jung, to come down to Hyderabad in the Deccan. And he takes a job in the Nizam's government. At that point, Ellen, his wife, who is practicing Islam and observing Purda, comes out, as we've been discussing, and they socialize together in Hyderabad circles. He's sort of in the Nizam's government, and she's linked in a little bit with the residency. He's very successful. He has several promotions. As I mentioned, he's invited to London. They meet Queen Victoria. And then in the late 1880s, when they get back from that trip, a year or two later, a pamphlet is published, a very scandalous pamphlet comes out, which makes accusations against not Mehdi Hasan, but against Ellen Donnelly, his wife. And Hasan is upset by this and launches a court case. And it was that court case transcript which got me first introduced to the story. At the end of the case, the judge basically dismisses the charges, but everything has come out over a year-long court case. Mehdi Hasan is fired from his job, and they have to flee Hyderabad and go back to Lucknow, where he lives in sort of obscurity and dies young. And then Ellen Donnelly lives on in real poverty before finally passing away at the beginning of the 20th century. So it's a story in my mind about, it's a love story between the couple. It's the story of social mobility and how these people could come from pretty humble backgrounds, reach all the way to the Nizam's court, to Queen Victoria's court, and then through the politics of the 19th century, fall all the way back down the social ladder.
I just wanted to ask you, this question probably I would have asked you later, about the way in which you have narrated the story. You, being a historian, you took the narrative style of narrating this entire story. And so was it, I mean, as a professional historian, was it a difficult choice to make?
Yes, it was, in that I should provide a little context. You know, as you mentioned, I'm a professional historian at an American university. I'd already published 2 books on Indian history, South Asian history. The first one, which was my doctoral thesis that then became a book, was actually on Hyderabad, what's now Telangana. And that book looked at the Samastans, you know, places like Gadwal, Vanaparthi, Jataprol, and the role that those small kingdoms played in the Nizam's time. And then I moved away from Hyderabad to write a book about clubs, which brought me back to the Secunderabad Club, among other places. And then I came back to the story of Mehdi and Ellen, and I wanted once in my career to write a book that I could give comfortably to people outside of the academy, friends who, you know, might be just want something to read on a long plane trip, or who weren't interested in all the heavy academic theorizing and footnoting that the other books and that scholars tend to do. So I made the decision pretty early on to embrace a narrative style. I was channeling, you know, my inner William Dalrymple, I guess, thinking about the way in which historians like he is make history in Indian history and Deccan history really accessible to a wider audience. And so it was a conscious choice. I don't know how successful I was writing in that narrative style. That's for other people to decide. But I really enjoyed it. It wasn't easy, but I hope that the book will be accessible to a wider audience. The academics can pick it up and find the race, gender, ethnicity, etc., class, caste, all those things are there. But I wanted to write something for a popular audience.
Thank you, Ben. And Serish is back.
So your book has a lot of racy details.
Yeah.
How comfortable were you writing about it?
Yeah.
So when you're writing it, I realized you are not very comfortable. Were you?
It was, you know, the racy details come from the documents, come from the sources themselves. I wasn't making this up. And I was simply quoting, for instance, the men in the trial who testified to having sexual relations with Ellen. I let them do the speaking. Of course, she denied all of it. But it was part of the story at the time, and I think it would have been wrong to gloss over those. I was really surprised in the pamphlet, but also in the trial, how explicit
Yes.
some of the people described their relations with Ellen, and I thought that was interesting, and I thought it would be fun to read, and you know, just let the voices from the past speak.
Yeah, actually, those details give a sense of the cultural modes of that period,
Yes.
right? And
Yeah.
can you read a small passage from the book so that it's useful for the people who may not have read the book?
Yeah, sure. I picked out two small passages. One is about Mehdi Hasan from one of the people in the trial, and the other is Ellen's voice herself. So let me get to the one. So this is from the book. In my edition, it's page 131. So this is Yusuf Uzzaman talking about Mehdi Hasan's desire to launch the case. No doubt done its service very truly now. They may hang Mitra or his effigy, but M.H., Mehdi Hasan, friends to institute this case. And then he goes on, there certainly was a row in 1889, but the matter was hushed up and suppressed. And the fire, though smothered for a time, was not wholly extinguished. It blazed this time through folly of the man himself. And you get a sense there that Mehdi Hasan's critics, and from Mehdi's own writing, he was a fellow with a lot of pride, and he was, in a sense, defending the honor of his wife, but the way in which he went about it with the court case, we could question whether that was the right path. So in something from Ellen also. So this is later in the story. This is when Ellen is nearing the end of her life. It's page 267. And she's writing to her friend in Hyderabad from Lucknow. And Ellen is a widow. They had no children. She's dependent on some other elderly Britons, poor white Brits who live in the back lanes of Lucknow. And she writes this letter to her friend in Hyderabad. She says, but had I not had all these terrible troubles and trials, I would have still been the same frivolous, careless person you knew. Now I am quite different. But adieu, dear kind friend, your friendship also I can never repay. And so there you have a sense of Ellen in the arc of her life. She's looking back, right? And she said, oh, when I was a young woman, she calls herself frivolous. But then having gone through the ordeal of the trial and the hardships of that, the fall from their elevated position, she's reflecting back. And I was really moved when I found those letters by her and could see her talking about her life near its end.
So while researching the book, I see a lot of reference to the letters, to the reports written by the Hindu correspondent, the Hindu newspaper correspondent.
Yes. Yeah.
So like that, you have a lot of references to other information. So while researching, what all places did you go?
Well, so the project, I mean, I was gifted the Xerox, the original published court manuscript, and then that wasn't enough to write a book, so I went to London, and there at the British Library, the India Office Records Library, there, and I tell this story at the end of the book. On the last day of a research trip, I was out of money, I was out of time. I was, it was the very end of the trip. I hadn't found the pamphlet until the last minute. And so the pamphlet is there in London. Then I came to Delhi and I found records from the Indian British government in Delhi, the Viceroy's correspondence and that sort of thing. And then in Hyderabad, as Vijay mentioned, the state archive there in Karnataka had a wealth of information. There were several of Ellen's letters were there. And then I was very lucky that I had access to the archive at Chao Mahalla Palace. And there were a matching set of letters from Ellen, which sort of told me things at the end of the research period that were just invaluable. And I want to express a deep gratitude to the staff of both of those archives in Hyderabad and also at the National Archive in Delhi. Without their work, if anyone is there watching, without your service, this book would not have been possible. So I'm very grateful to them.
I was looking for seeing the pamphlet in the book. It's not there.
Well, it's a little too long to reproduce. Is one of the problems.
100 words, right?
No, it's a few thousand words, and it was a little too long to reproduce. And I cite it quite heavily in the book, but decided that we could have done a photographic copy of it, but that would have, there would have been a problem with cost and publication. And I didn't feel that it was worth citing in full. It would have gone on for several pages, but maybe in a second edition.
What do you feel about the pamphlet now? Like, it really destroyed the career of two people. Okay. And these two people might have been affected, but there were other victims also. Like, it affected Salajan also. Salajan too.
Yeah.
It affected Salajan's reputation. What impact did this pamphlet have on the officials of the Nizam? Like Sarwar Jung and even Salajan and other people, they were drawn to the court, they had to attend this thing. So, did it impact their careers? Because Salajan's details are also out in because of the case, because of the trial, and a lot of revelations are made about his sexual life and how he met people and what was his choice, where would he meet, how would he meet, and all that. So, did it impact his career in the sense Salajan had a very short official career according to in the Nizam's thing?
Right. I think it did impact. This is the second Salar Jung we're talking about, but he was probably not the best choice. He was very close to Mahbub Ali Khan in age, and I think the Nizam had a hard time correcting him. And the second Salar Jung seemed to have enjoyed a more he's sort of a man about town. I don't think this pamphlet, though, did him in. I think it was one of several things under his tenure that led to him resigning. The pamphlet scandal, though, I think was a turning point in some sense for politics in Hyderabad, in that Hyderabad had had several scandals. This is not the only one. There were several scandals of the time, and it's after this one that you see the Nizam, Mahbub Ali Khan at the time, really clean house. Sarwar Jung resigns or was pushed out, and he goes back to North India. Plowden, who is the resident, who's very unpopular, who didn't like Mehdi Hasan, he also is sort of forced out / steps down. And after the pamphlet scandal, Hyderabad's not rocked by any other big scandals. So at one point, I dubbed this the last great scandal in Hyderabad. And so it did impact, of course, Mehdi and Ellen most directly. But in a sense, it brought about change to Hyderabad at a larger scale.
See, one thing, like the story reverberates across the time. In the sense, when I'm reading the book, there's a Hindi movie called Julie, where Anglo-Indian person is stereotyped as free with morals and goes around the place. Man is a drunkard, the husband is a drunkard, the mother takes care of the children. So, is there an element of stereotyping during the court case and the trial and the result and all?
Yeah,
it's seen as a Eurasian at one point of time, and even this Mehdi Hasan invokes that if I was a Britisher, things would have been different.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I think that Mehdi Hasan and Ellen, you know, were part of communities that over time have become stereotyped. There's less that's been written about Europeans or Anglo-Indians, whatever we call them, who were from the lower classes. And Ellen certainly came up in the back lanes of Lucknow. She wasn't one of these white women who married a Raja or Maharaja. And so it's a little more difficult to find a way in which she's a stereotype. Mehdi Hasan was made fun of. They said, oh, you know, he says he's a zamindar from North India, but everybody is a zamindar in North India. You know, he certainly wasn't a drunkard, though. So, yeah, I think that the story reverberates across time.
Father was a drunkard. Ellen's
What's that?
father is seen as a drunkard.
Yeah. He's a drunkard. He's a pundit. Sometimes he's both at the same time. So it's, yeah.
So, at some point of a time, the story becomes too racy. You have a lot of details about the personal lives and other things. And certain times it becomes more of the court procedure and all that. So how did you navigate all these things?
Yeah, it was, again, is sort of coming back to Vijay's question about a narrative style. As I became familiar with their lives, I wanted to start the book 2/3 of the way through the story with them fleeing Hyderabad and trying to imagine their feelings at the time, getting on that train and leaving behind their lives in Hyderabad. And then moving back in time to bring the reader up through the pamphlet. And then later in the book actually come to the end of their lives. And so I guess I was thinking of a almost Bollywood type opening scene of them at Nampally railway station, boarding the train, almost all alone. They have their puppy dog with them and maybe a servant, and bringing the reader into the story of their lives that way, and then moving back in time and then finishing the story as their lives finish.
There's a lot of communication that happens in the between Lucknow, Hyderabad, and the officials in Calcutta and other places. So, how efficient was this communication system? Like, was it people who are involved who could access this information?
Well, for the Nizam's government and for the British residency and their communications with Calcutta and London, they're using the telegraph system, and so speed of communication wasn't so much of a problem. For the everyday people, they seem to have gotten wind of the story through newspaper coverage. The press were allowed into the courtroom, and each day they would reprint verbatim sections of testimony. And so that was available to a wider audience who weren't part of government circles.
So these newspapers were distributed in Lucknow and Hyderabad simultaneously or something? How?
I believe so. At least in Hyderabad, the trial as it unfolded was covered in local newspapers. And I think that they were able to share that, across India, and even newspapers in London were well aware of each day's testimony and what people were saying.
One of the criticism for the book is the quality of the photograph is not great.
Yeah.
So, what was the problem in getting better photographs? Even Ellen's photograph, it is so much reference, there's so much discussion about it.
Yeah.
But the photo looks very ordinary.
Yeah, and I apologize. It's a fair criticism. It's just the way in which the book was produced by the publisher and the quality of the original photographs. The photograph of Ellen, the one that I know is her, where she's dressed in a sari, and I spent some time discussing it, that the original photograph is the size of a passport photo. And so we had to take a very high quality scan of it and enlarge it. And in doing that, it loses some of its some of its clarity, and then reprinted on ordinary paper in the book, again, it loses some of its clarity. So I apologize to the reader for that.
Would you like to work with somebody to make a movie on this book?
I'd love to. I'd love to.
So what would you look for in somebody producing a movie like that? What quality?
Yeah, I would hope that someone who took up the story would use lines from the actual letters, use the words of Mehdi Hasan himself. He kept a diary which he published. Of course, we have everybody's voice in the trial transcript, and it would be lovely if this were ever to become a film, if somebody was sensitive to that and not, be as true to the sources as possible. Because I just had a really large number of voices for the book, and the challenge was not too little material, but it was sifting and winnowing a much larger amount of material.
I think Vijay would want to have the questions from now on.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Serish. Great conversation, and it brought out the. Sorry.
Disciplined conversation.
Yeah, and in very disciplined manner, yes. And it actually brought out the details of the book. And before I take questions, and there have been a few questions, and I encourage our audience to go on and type the questions in the chat box, and I will try and squeeze in as many as possible. But before I take up the audience questions, Ben, I just had two quick questions. One was, you have in the map that you have included in the book of territories which are princely states, and the other one is the British part of, and you have colored them yellow and pink. I was just going to ask you two questions. One is, if Ellen and Mehdi's love story, if it had happened before 1857, do you think the trajectory of their life would have been different? Number one. And number two, if they did not move from Lucknow, which was a princely state, to Lucknow to Hyderabad, do you think their lives would have been better?
If they had met and married before 1857, that's an interesting question. It's a great question. I don't see the sort of opportunities for social mobility as numerous before 1857 for a couple like that as I do at the end of the 19th century. So they might have married, they might have had a life together. I think they would have stayed in Lucknow, which brings me to your second question. And there, I think, had they stayed in Lucknow, I think they would have had maybe humbler but reasonably happy lives. They never had children. I don't know what happened there, but his talent, his sort of pushiness as an up and coming bureaucrat just meshed, I think, very well with what was needed in Hyderabad at the time, the trend in Hyderabad to bring North Indians to help in the Nizam's territory. I think it was just a good fit for him, but it ultimately led to them falling from such heights.
Yeah, in fact, Salarjung brought several people from the North India, partly also, of course, apart from their administrative skills, but also partly to, as a kind of a counterweight to the, internal politics of the Nizam's family itself. Wasn't that the case?
It is the case, and people have worked on this insider-outsider dynamic. The wonderful historian of Hyderabad, Karan Leonard, who's one of the first people to talk about this, the mulki, non-mulki divide. And the story of Mehdi Hasan is part of that story, that is outsiders being brought in either to counterbalance local Hyderabad politics or to bring people in that were perceived to have other skills that would be useful to Hyderabad at the time. And that seems to have been Salarjung's initiative to bring North Indians to Hyderabad.
And just to connect to something that Serish had mentioned, was there also a kind of communal angle to the entire case? Because the printer against whom Mehdi filed a suit was a Hindu.
Yes.
And Hasan Mehdi was a Muslim, and very interestingly, he had more faith in the British administration or British justice than the Nizam's courts. In spite of the fact that he himself was a judicial officer.
Yeah, I never found any evidence of a communal dynamic in the story. The printer, Mitra, who is a Bengali, and yes, a Hindu, was, they had to sue somebody. Mehdi Hasan felt that he had to take action against somebody. And since the name on the pamphlet was a fake name and they couldn't find proof of anybody who actually wrote it, he couldn't do any better than to sue the printer. So I didn't see any communal angle there. And then, Mehdi Hasan had been chief of the Hyderabad High Court. And so I think there was a conflict of interest for him to file the case in the Hyderabad judicial system. He also, I think, was something of an Anglophile, and he believed that he would get a better hearing by filing it in the Residency Bazaar Court, which is also where the printer was located. So technically, even if you take out the British side of things, he filed it in the court that had jurisdiction of where the printing took place, and that was a court under the Residency under Bosanquet.
And you were mentioning of his being a very Anglophile. Obviously there are a couple of questions actually also related to it, that his for example, his egregious behavior when he met Queen Elizabeth, and he's going into kind of raptures over that
Yes.
meeting, and that obviously reminds some of our audience, and also the whole court scene, or the proceedings of the court, which become the central part of the book, and the angle of sexuality. All this reminds one of E.M. Foster's Passage to India.
Yes, yeah. He was born and raised in India under the time of the Raj, and he saw, I think, British jurisdiction, having grown up in Lucknow in North India, as a viable and maybe valuable path for his career. And so when he, as you said, when he meets Victoria, he really lays it on thick. He had tears in his eyes and was just so moved. And this is maybe difficult for us to choke down now. But he represents, a group of people who felt that British rule was a good thing in South Asia, and it's not easy to reconcile now. But at the time, again, I let Mehdi's own voice speak rather than me add something to that.
Yeah, let me take questions from our audience. The first question that I see is from Arun, who asks, to what extent research materials are available in terms of non-subjective resources?
Non-subjective resources, what?
I mean, probably personal letters or personal, other than that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, sure. Well, many of Ellen's letters are available. They're there in Hyderabad itself. Mehdi Hasan wrote a diary, which he then published privately and it circulated. That diary was then republished with a nice introduction by the wonderful historian of Hyderabad, Omar Khalidi. And so you can read Mehdi Hasan's private diary. It's a Google book available for free online, or if you want to get a copy, Oxford University Press brought out Omar Khalidi's thing. And then you have a few other letters, but most of the material for the book is available either in the archive or in published format.
What kind of materials?
Well, for instance, the trial transcript was printed as a book, and that's available. It's available here in North America. That's right. There is a copy in the Salarjung Museum Library as well. So not far for you in Hyderabad to go and get a copy.
Yeah. And then the second question is from Ramakrishna, who asks whether this scandal was sidelined by the coming of Gandhi and turning away people's attention from this particular scandal.
Right. Well, Gandhiji comes back to India at a time when the scandal's pretty much wound up. And so you do see, and I discussed this a little bit in the book, that some members of who were involved in the trial were active Congress members, whereas Mehdi Hasan thought that Congress in the nationalist movement was quite dangerous. And so the national politics that are growing in India in the latter part of the 19th century play a role in the background of the scandal. But by the time Gandhi comes back from South Africa to India, everybody is gone from this story.
Now that you mentioned that, what was Mehdi Hasan's attitude towards the nationalist movement or the Congress party or the Indian movement or whatever?
Yeah, he thought that the Indian National Congress was dangerous, and he was opposed to it early on. At one point he says it's a pile of loose dynamite ready to go off, and he's quite vocal about that. And that's a story that I'm not sure if we know as much about for India's modern history. That is those Indians who actually opposed the Congress. But he was one of them. And then again, at the end of his life, you see him sort of veering around, as his obituary said, that he veers round to Congress. And in fact, he hosts a dinner for the Congress party members when Mehdi is back in Lucknow and Congress holds a meeting there. I found a record that Mehdi Hasan, in fact, hosted that dinner. So he seems to have changed his mind over time, but early on was opposed to Congress.
Do you think he was disillusioned by his own personal experience about the British justice?
I think so. I think he felt cut off, betrayed, double-crossed by the British. This was a system that he was so enamored with and was part of and proud of and contributed to. And then because of this court case, he's completely cut off. He loses his pension. He loses not only his Hyderabad pension, but also his British pension, which he had a right to. He's not allowed to be re-employed by the British government of India in Lucknow, which he had a claim to. And I think he died embittered. And I think that bitterness probably brought him round to the ideas that Congress was circulating.
In fact, his journey back to Lucknow and what you just mentioned about his growing or his change of opinion towards the Congress and the nationalist politics, again, reminds two of our audience, Atul Nair as well as Sirisha, about the same kind of journey that Dr. Aziz makes in Passage to India, from and finally, Aziz also ends up in a princely state, the Hindu princely states. The other question that I have here is from PLR, who asks the question, when a historical record takes a narrative form, is it likely to get into a bit of description that is not strictly historical, but a but fictional?
That's a great question. And I think, you know, the historian has to be very careful to make clear and to write narrative that is grounded in as much historical fact as we can muster. And I was as clear as possible about using a narrative structure, but allowing the voices from the story to speak clearly, and only, you know, for instance, I say when Ellen comes into the courtroom, I think I said that there must have been, you know, whispers and gasps as the star of the show entered. I don't know that there were whispers or gasps, but I suggest that's probably the reaction of what happened. And so I was very careful to not insert anything into the story that I couldn't really stand behind.
But again, to go back to the question that I asked you earlier, as a historian, would you allow this kind of books as, let's say, part of the historically reliable material in a, let's say, in a history curriculum?
I think so. I think the book is grounded in archival sources. You know, I would stand behind the factual claims made in the book, and I tried to separate out where I was making an argument or where it was my own opinion. The book has been well reviewed by academics. Amazon hasn't been as kind to me, but the academic circle, who I really didn't write it directly for, has been much kinder. And so I think my colleagues who are professional historians have responded positively to the book, and I hope that more people will read it outside of the academy, because that was really the intended audience.
There's a question from Naga Sridhar, who asks, in this kind of writing, how do we safeguard the image of the woman involved in the scandal? As a historian, how do you shape popular perception of her today?
Well, I grew to have a lot of respect and affection for Ellen. And I think she was a victim of a nasty pamphlet, because they couldn't attack Mehdi Hasan. His reputation was solid. So I felt very sorry for her. And then having her letters and hearing her own voice when she was near the end of her life only added to my respect for her. I do think that in her youth, she might have bestowed her favors on different people in Lucknow. I don't think that was unusual at the time. I don't think that, you know, makes her a bad person. She clearly loved Mehdi Hasan. It was a love marriage. They stayed married their whole lives. He could have left her, she could have left him. And in the end, I thought she was quite courageous and quite insightful in that she recognized the arc of her life, and that she had grown as a woman from her experience.
And also, I think she remained loyal to him till the end, and on his behalf, she wrote appeals to the Nizam for a pension. And it's quite touching, the kind of letters that she wrote.
Yes, and she signs her name Mrs. Mehdi Hasan. Long after he's dead, she still identifies as his wife. And yes. I found that very moving.
And Uma Sridhar asks, in the course of your research, did you come across other such couples where an Indian man marries a European woman? How successful or unsuccessful were their unions? And did they also face social censure and prejudices?
Yeah, I think there's two levels that we can answer that question. There are, of course, some very famous examples of European women who marry Indian nobility. There's a whole book about this called Wicked Women of the Raj, which looks at a series of marriages between mostly British women and Indian princes and Nawabs and such. And then there's a second sort of layer to this question of men and women who are not at the elite levels of Indian society, Victorian society. And in doing the research for this, I came across a few references to other interracial couples, but I think there's more research that needs to be done on those. Then those couples undoubtedly faced, discrimination by Britons, especially, maybe also by Indians. But I think there's more work that that can be done on this.
Yeah, and
Would you consider-
Giridhar Rao, sorry, Sirish?
Yeah. Would you consider Ellen as a wicked woman?
No. I think I'm sort of grown fond of her, having studied her and her life for almost a decade. And I think that she made choices early in her life, and maybe those caught up with her, but I don't think she was wicked. And I think she lived as a respectable married woman with Mehdi Hasan.
And one of our audience, Giridhar Rao, supplies this information about Bilkis Latif's book about her mother, who was French, married to, of course, and that book is called Her India, where again we talk about interracial marriages. And one more question, this is from Srinivas Reddy, who asks, many recent histories of Hyderabad seem to revolve around sexuality and scandal. Why is this? Does it reflect something about South Asian studies today?
I'm not sure I would agree that many books on Hyderabad are about sexuality and scandal. I think many books are about communal relations, are about the nationalist movement in Hyderabad and the princely state. There's a turn towards urban history of Hyderabad. And South Asian studies, there are wonderful people in the academy, both in India and all over the world, in Europe and North America, who are interested in questions of race, gender, sexuality, and have taken up topics or stories from India's history that highlight this. Certainly the book was not meant to be all about sex. That's, I think, actually a pretty small part of it. I think really it's a love story between Mehdi and Ellen. And the sexy bits are brought out in the court case against her by their enemies, and it's difficult to know how much of that was even true. I mean, people were paid to say things in court. Perjury seems to have been quite common. So,
yeah, and I think it was Rebecca who says probably the wicked women is a poor title, something inappropriate, or was it ironic?
Yeah, I haven't looked at that book in a few years, but that author was making arguments about the jump for British women to come out to India and to marry Indian men, and the way in which they were perceived by other Britons as somehow doing something that was against the social mores of the time. And so I think it's in that spirit that book chose that title.
Yeah, and we are almost towards the end of our session. Just a couple of questions. One is that, do you think overall, does anybody come out better from this entire scandal? Including Salar Jang, who brought, maybe, or the Nizam's administration, or the British justice system. Does anybody or anything, does anybody come out in better light?
Well, I think in some ways Hyderabad comes out better after this, in that it's like I said before, I think it's the last big scandal. Hyderabad had been rocked by several scandals, and after this one, the Nizam, cleans house. There's a change in the way business is done, and the state moves on to other business, and you don't see government rocked by scandals like this anymore. And so I think, in a sense, the administration said enough is enough. Let's make some hard decisions. People moved on from their positions or were let go, and I think Hyderabad comes out better after this. So maybe that's the winner, if there is one.
And did you think that the image of Hyderabad as a cosmopolitan city, always open to different cultures, etc.? Do you think that image gets a bit hit in this book?
No, not at all. I think it's the opposite, in that Mehdi Hasan and Hyderabadis are traveling all over the world. Mehdi Hasan goes to London as a representative of Hyderabad, but there are other nobles who go to other places as representatives of Hyderabad, let alone travel across South Asia. Mehdi and Ellen are up in Kashmir at some point on holiday. And the rest of the world also comes to Hyderabad. There are Americans there, there are Britons, of course. The Deccan has a long history of connection with people of Africa, from the Middle East. And so I think that rather than making Hyderabad seem more provincial, I think the scandal and its sort of national and international repercussions just shores up the idea that Hyderabad was plugged into much broader networks of mobility, of travel, and connections than we might have thought.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you very much, Serish. This has been a wonderful conversation between the two of you, and lovely questions from our audience.
Thank you.
I thank you once again. And it's always interesting that whenever we talk about the colonial period, particularly after 1857, I think when the racial responses to each other became a bit cold and frozen, I think whenever we talk about the colonial period, inevitably questions of women, sexuality, and questions of infidelity, etc., they all seem to, as our audience also pointed out, some of the classic stories always bring in. So I think the connection between colonialism and sexuality is something that probably needs to be looked at further, and how women figure in that entire process of colonization, and the colony itself being seen as being kind of raped in that sense. So I think these are wonderful conversations, and thank you once again, Serish and Ben, and once again to our audience, thank you very much for joining us, and please remember that 26th June we will be back with another online session of HLF, and that session will have Rajmohan Gandhi and Adhiraj Parthsarthi in conversation, and the book in focus would be Rajmohan Gandhi's book on South India. Thank you very much once again, and good night. Have a safe night. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Vijay. Thank you, HLF, and thank you, Suresh, for the opportunity to be with all of you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you once again. Thank you, Serish. Thank you.